Hi guys, welcome and thank you for rejoining me. We did have some technical difficulties there. I will do a recap for those joining us for the first time. Today, it's a Witchy Wednesday, and it's an unusual Witchy Wednesday because I will be talking about the history of male witches. Now, if you watched any of the other video, the brief 2-minute one I had just posted, I had asked people to conjure up the image of a witch in their mind. And for those of you who are confused about what happened, I do apologize. I have an older dog. She is deaf and blind and very loud. So she does not control herself very well when I'm doing these videos when she's allowed outside. So, just to catch up, if you had talked about a witch in the modern sense with most people, generally, that witch would be a female. This has not been the case for some areas of history. Now, generally, the persecuted witch was a female, and the thousands of people that died during the height of the witch fervor, generally most of them were female. But in some areas of the world, for some very diverse and different reasons, which I'll get into, the witch was not always female. In fact, in some areas of the world, it was often viewed that women could not be witches because they didn't have the ability, which in itself is a just chauvinistic view in already a chauvinistic area that witchcraft was. If you think of the most famous witch that you can, what name comes to mind? It's probably not Jan Jansen. Jan Jansen and his son, Jan Jansen, were two Icelandic witches. Two of the most famous Icelandic witches, in fact. In Iceland, in Normandy, in Estonia, in Burgundy, and in Russia, more men were persecuted and executed for being witches than females were. At their heydays, Iceland specifically was way more focused on the idea that a male could be a witch than a female could. And at the height of their witch trials between 1625 and 1685, 92% of those persecuted for witchcraft were males. Jan Jansen was an interesting character. Already in his town he was well known. He was perhaps the town drunk. There are rumors that he liked his drink. And he was blamed, the elder, for placing curses on a local reverend, Jan Magnusson. Whether or not what he said next to Jan Magnusson was in jest, or whether he was being entirely truthful, one night, while drunk, Jan Jansen admitted to Magnusson of sending an evil spirit at him. Magnusson had been looking around at the time for reasons why he had been experiencing night terrors. He claimed to have things like the feeling of a dog pressing a paw hot against his chest, or mice and cats crawling over him, causing him to wake up and stir and have to get up from his bed in the night. When Jan Jansen, for whatever reason, admitted to sending an evil spirit after him, this was all that Magnusson or the rest of the committee of the town needed to bring them, both Jan Janssens, in front of them. Magnusson had believed that this was a retaliation of sorts. You see, earlier, just a couple weeks prior, the younger Jan Jansen had to be admonished by the reverend for striking a woman in church. The fact that Jan Jansen was still upset over this, and he made it quite clear, both parties, the drunken father and the younger not so well behaved Janssen. And so, all of this evidence in hand, the town council had ruled that Jan Janssen had indeed performed witchcraft. The two were both made to publicly apologize in front of the entire town and promise not to perform any more witchcraft. For a while, it seemed like this was enough. Like this would be the end of the Janssens' witchcraft. Perhaps mightily unluckily for them, Magnussen's night terrors soon returned, and once again the blame fell on the Janssens. They were thrown in prison when they had another trial and could not prove enough witnesses that said they were not witches. They had to prove themselves innocent rather than anyone else proving them guilty. After 7 grueling months, it's unrecorded whether or not they were tortured, but generally that was how you drew a confession of witchcraft. And after 7 months in prison, they confessed. They were very quickly executed. They were burned at the stake for witchcraft, a very, very common form of punishment at the time for believed witches. They were 2 of the 21 executed in the entire span of the Icelandic height of the witch trials. 20 men and 1 woman. In other nearby countries, like Russia, men were more heavily prosecuted because it was generally the wandering people that got blamed for being witches and accused of supposed witchcraft. The wandering people were monks, minstrels, freed slaves, traveling merchants. Although all of these positions could be held by women and by females, it was far more likely at the time that these positions would be held by men, and that the men would be the ones to wander. Their place in society and the way that they operated made it very easy to target these people. They were strangers to most communities they visited, and with the pent-up ill feelings and angers of things like unexplainable sicknesses, crop droughts, really anything that you held rage for, you could direct it almost logically at these strange newcomers. It was easy because they wouldn't be missed by those in your community. They weren't known. It was a very common scapegoat. Another type of job, interestingly enough, often associated with witchcraft at the time, that was more predominantly held by men, was that of the shepherd. In Normandy, nearly half of those accused of witchcraft were shepherds. Why? Well, the record doesn't state exactly why in Normandy so many shepherds themselves were persecuted and executed for the crimes of witchcraft. There are some thoughts that exist based off of the shepherding profession. Much like the perceived idea of witchcraft, the shepherd surrounds themselves in nature. They seem to have a supernatural ability to control their animals, whether it's the shepherd dog that leads the flock or the flocks themselves. Shepherds were also known to have common healing herbs and practices and poultices that they would make either to heal their animals or to heal themselves. It wasn't uncommon to find a shepherd with a small herb garden used for healing. These things were often associated with witchcraft as well, so it wasn't impossible for those at the time to make the logical leap between a shepherd and someone who practices witchcraft. There was another aspect, commonly tied to witches, that would indeed be tied to shepherds, albeit antagonistically. The shepherd was very often, almost essentially, associated with the wolf. The wolf was a very common symbol of evil in medieval times. And as well, during the heights of the witchcraft, wolves were still a problem. And the fear of wolves spread towards the fear of witchcraft. Their association with wolves no doubt makes the shepherd a logical conclusion and jump. Why were people accused of witchcraft? Though undoubtedly there were some witches at the time, why? Why were some who were completely innocent accused? Well, one proponent for this spread of witchcraft and this panic that surrounded it was a man in Britain known as the Witch Finder General, Matthew Hopkins. In just 2 years, it's believed that he has overseen the execution of 300 people for the charge of witchcraft. It didn't seem to matter to Hopkins whether you were a male or a female, whether you were old or young, your position in society. It didn't matter to Hopkins. And why? Why didn't it matter? Unfortunately, it seems like it didn't matter because he was paid extremely well for each confession and subsequent execution that he performed. This man accused innocent people and tortured them to get their confessions from them. In fact, one of the most well-known victims of Hopkins was a reverend named John Lowes. He was an 80-year-old reverend at the time when he was accused of witchcraft. He vehemently denied that he was a witch or even involved in witchcraft. He claimed he was a pious man, a man of the cloth and of the Lord. And unfortunately for him, 10% of witches at the time were clergymen. It did not seem like being a man of religion or a man of the cloth would excuse you from assumptions of witchcraft. In fact, if anything, your close relationship with God, or even perhaps the devil, made it so that you were more likely, not less, to be a witch. The 80-year-old Lowes vehemently denied, because of course he did, his accusation of witchcraft. Hopkins resorted to torture. In a small confined cell, he kept Lowes up for nights on end. Worse still, he would make Lowes do sprints back and forth, touching the walls of his cell each time. With a lack of sleep, and sprinting from wall to wall, sometimes colliding into it, he still maintained his innocence. This 80-year-old man fought until he could fight no longer, until they dragged him to a local moat and dunked him underwater. It's not known how many times they dunked this man, but he eventually confessed to everything that they wanted him to. And on that day, he was one of 18 people that Hopkins executed. Now, the story of male witches is not always one of persecution. A male with superpowers perceived was just as likely to be perceived as a wizard, or a shaman, or a seer. It was far more likely and far more often that men with magic got the benefit of the doubt than women. If a woman had witch powers, if she had witchcraft, if she had magic, that was generally a sign that she had consorted with the devil. She had done some sort of evil to be able to get these powers. But if you were a man, and you had some magic power and had not outright used it for evil, the perception probably would have been that you were a wizard, or a seer, or a shaman, or a soothsayer. You got the benefit of the doubt. So what is a warlock? Well, a warlock is, in fact, just a male witch. There were very few societies and cultures that took the care or the time to differentiate and separate their word for a male or a female witch. If you were a practitioner of the dark arts, you got one label. That was it. But the early modern Scots, for whatever reason, took it upon themselves to differentiate, and they called a male witch a warlock, and they called a female witch a witch. And that is where we get the term warlock from. But it is a colloquial term, not a catch-all. A male witch in Russia, in Iceland, in Normandy, in Britain, would have just been a male witch, or just simply a witch. A warlock would have only existed at the time in Scotland. It was more adopted by things later like Dungeons and Dragons and put into prevalent use as the male practitioner of witchcraft. So what's a wizard? Well, a wizard was obviously a good male practitioner of magic. Interesting that nowadays we have good witches as well, but back in the 15 and 1600s, you would not have found those that would claim that female witches even had the possibility of being good. Glinda the Good Witch would have been something that they could not wrap their minds around. But a male wizard, like Merlin, one that had been revered in tales for a very long time, well, everyone knew that that was just a male who could practice magic. But he got a special place in society. And so while the history of persecution of men as witches does run deep, and thousands have lost their lives based off of accusations of witchcraft, both male and female, completely innocent of any wrongdoings. The history of a male as a practitioner of magic who could do good was generally deeper and thought of as more of a possibility. And there were instances like what almost happened with Jan Janssen and his son, in which a simple "I'm sorry" or "I repent" would have been good enough for a male witch to escape persecution. But a female witch, upon confession, generally would only find one thing waiting for her: execution. So the history of male witches does run deep. They have not escaped persecution, but they have, more often than not, been celebrated by their cultures. Thank you so much for joining me once again on actually for the first time on my Witchy Wednesday. I hope to do some more of these deep dives into the history of witches, perhaps warlocks, wizards, maybe even specific ones. The male witch does still exist to this day. There are practitioners of magic and witchcraft that are male. The history has not died out, though generally, to this day, when we think of witches as a culture, we think of a female.